Hello and welcome to the National D-Day Memorials Lunchbox Lecture today. I'm John Long, the Director of Education, and am thrilled to have you join us virtually. And I'd be remiss if I didn't invite you to come see us personally. The National D-Day Memorial is open. We're not doing guided tours because of the COVID restrictions, and there's some other social distancing regulations in place. However, this is a beautiful time of the year to come visit the memorial, walk the grounds, learn about the history of D-Day, enjoy the view as the leaves start to change. And if you haven't been in a while, by all means, come on up the hill and see us at the memorial because it's just a beautiful sight in October. This is, of course, one of many virtual programs we have been offering this year because of the realities of the pandemic. And we have discovered that something we started doing as sort of a stopgap has actually been very popular and is a great way for us to meet our mission through some innovative technology. Because, of course, when we have a Lunchbox lecture here in Bedford, you pretty much have to be in Bedford to come and join it. But with the magic of the internet, we can broadcast these lectures across the globe, and you can watch them live, as many of you are, of course, right now, or watch them later on in your own schedule. And that's been a popular option as well. So we've discovered this is a great way for us to help to teach the history of D-Day and World War II and other related topics. And so very pleased to tell you about some other upcoming digital events that we have going on. If you go to our webpage on the education department, you'll see we have some student live streams that are coming up on the connections between the First World War and the Second World War. And then the same day, October 13th, a Tuesday in the afternoon, Maggie will be speaking on the rise of the Third Reich and the history that led into the Second World War, of course, later on. And those are for school kids. The information is on our webpage if you are interested. We are also doing live virtual tours of the memorial once a week. If you aren't able to come to the memorial and walk around in 3 dimensions, we can take you around and show you. And again, the details of how to sign up for that are on our webpage. Homeschoolers, if any are tuning in, we have our homeschool day that normally has been, of course, an in-person event and very popular in-person events. And yeah, they're not so possible this year. And so a virtual homeschool day will be Friday, October 16th from 10 to noon. If you'd like to join in for that. And again, details of how to sign up are on the webpage. Our next Lunchbox lecture series after today will be Rick Beyer, an author who's written about D-Day and about the Ghost Army of D-Day, but has also written a book on presidential history. And so he'll be telling some little-known tales of presidential history in a program called Hail to the Chiefs on Thursday, October 22nd at noon, same place where you're watching this now. And then last one I'll mention, although we have a lot more on our webpage if you check out our upcoming events, is that our Veterans Day ceremony this year will also be a virtual commemoration, and the will be broadcast live on November 11th at starting at 11 a.m. Of course, you can watch it later on as well, but we will be launching our Veterans Day virtual program on Veterans Day at 11, much as we did Memorial Day and our June 6th commemorations earlier in the year. And they have been enormously popular, so we're looking forward to offering that. We, of course, would love to have our veterans get together and be able to shake their hands, but this is just not the year for it. And so we will be virtual for Veterans Day as well. But today's program is one I've been looking forward to very much. Our speaker is Norman Fine, who will be joining us in just a minute. Norman is a graduate of Dartmouth College and Dartmouth's School of Engineering, the Thayer School of Engineering. He and his associate formed an engineering company that in its early years designed and manufactured precision radar and infrared cathode tube displays used by the Air Force and Navy for aerial reconnaissance during the Cold War. And I mention all that to say he knows his stuff. This is a man who's really an expert on the subject. He's written several books and hundreds of articles published abroad, and on many of them on an interesting topic that may be worth revisiting in another Lunchbox lecture, a history of horse sports. That would be an interesting talk sometime as well, Norm. But today his topic is a recent book, Blind Bombing: How Microwave Radar brought two allies to D-Day. And it's his first book on military history and has already been widely received and well recognized, winning a silver medal for world history in the 2020 Independent Book Publishers Award. And so, Norm, welcome to our virtual program. It's great to meet you virtually. We haven't met face-to-face, but we've communicated by email for some time since your book came out, and we are looking forward to your talk.
John, thank you very much. Much appreciated. And good afternoon to you all. Certainly honored to be talking to you today as a guest of the National D-Day Memorial.
Well, we are thrilled to have you, and an interesting subject. A lot of people, if you're a World War II buff, you know, of course, a little bit about the air war, but not many of us think about the technology that made it successful. And so I've been looking forward to this presentation.
All right, thanks again, John. Greetings. That was a very nice introduction. Thank you, John. I'm honored to be speaking to you all today as a guest of the D-Day Memorial. This institution really owns a place in perpetuity for remembering, recognizing the men of America's greatest generation who, on June 6, 1944, were the first to land on what was, on that day, the largest ground invasion by sea in the history of the world. For my part, in discussing my book, it's very appropriate. My book, Blind Bombing, really reaches its conclusion and ends in the last chapter on D-Day. It was all about how we got there. D-Day was not a firm date in the minds of Allied military leaders. There were certain requirements out of the control of anybody, and other prerequisites within the control of the armed services. First, it had to be in late spring or summer, just for comfort of those that were going ashore. The Germans learned that lesson in Russia as they were invading and trying to take over Russia in the winter. Had to be at the time of an incoming tide. These infantrymen were slogging their way off the landing crafts to the beach, and they had to get there as fast as they could and keep moving to make way for others that were coming ashore. Had to be a night of a full moon or nearly a full moon for visibility. Just getting into those landing crafts and seeing where they were going once they got there. D-Day was certainly enough of a dangerous gamble, even after certain other prerequisites had been achieved. The problem was they weren't being achieved. And D-Day, as we know it, on June 6, 1944, would not have happened without the invention on the very eve of the war by two British physicists of a small gadget that hardly anyone has ever heard of. Yet today, that gadget sits in a box of just about, in a box on the kitchen counter of just about everybody in the developed world. But you've still never seen this gadget unless you've torn your microwave oven apart, which you ought not to do. And it's probably pretty well hidden even then. Let me tell you how I discovered this story and came to write Blind Bombing. Many years ago, almost 60, a colleague and I signed on as consulting engineers to Raytheon Company. Raytheon had an important contract, large contract from the FAA, Federal Aviation Administration, to design and then manufacture a new generation of air traffic control displays for the controllers in the towers. This new display was called the RBDE-5. It was a next generation system, a big advance over the previous technology, and definitely state of the art. And when the project was over, my friend and I looked at each other and said, "Jeepers, we know something that only a handful of people know how to do in this country. Why don't we go into business?" Which we did. And it was the period of the Cold War. Aerial reconnaissance was a high priority for the military. Much of our work was on the contract to the Naval Research Lab and the Air Force. And we were designing and building for them precision, high resolution radar displays, film recording radar displays, infrared recording displays. And being at the state of the art, we had one sort of problem, a scarcity of published design guides, textbooks, to help us in our work. So we searched the literature, and this is what started getting me off into this direction, just a matter of curiosity. Well, we did find a volume of books, a 10-volume set of books that were published by the MIT in Cambridge, Mass, by their radiation lab. It was published right after the war. MIT wanted the world to know all the things that they had discovered and the technology of I mean, these were definitely engineering books to help you design these different gadgets that hardly anyone had ever heard of. So we found another book, Radar in World War II by Henry Gerlach, and that was a 2-volume history of MIT's radiation lab. And I learned that that rad lab was established in 1940 for the sole purpose of designing advanced radars for the war effort. Described the scientists' accomplishments, how they did what they did, under great pressure in a matter of months. I learned that a gadget called the Resonant Cavity Magnetron was invented in England. It was secretly revealed to high-ranking military officials and scientists here in this country in 1940, was the revolutionary device around which microwave radar sits at MIT's rad lab and in England were designed. And I learned that one radar in particular developed at the rad lab. It's called the H2X, also called the Mickey. It was installed in a small number of B-17s in the 8th Air Force, operated by an equally small number of radar navigators, specially trained B-17 navigators. Well, I knew that my uncle Stanley was a highly decorated B-17 navigator, so I called him. And I said, "Stanley, did you run across any of these?" I mean, at the time, there were very few of these planes when they started out. Very few of these planes, 12 of them in the entire 8th Air Force. When he brought, well, I asked him that question and there's a silence on the phone. And then all of a sudden I hear, "Norman, I brought the first production model of the H2X radar to England to begin my combat tour. I was a Mickey operator. So knowing that this trail that had become and just been following in simple curiosity, it brought me to my own uncle. And I was starting to think that this is a story that people don't really know and it should be told. In the very next town to me, I found the man who was the project leader at the Rad Lab on this very radar, George Valley. He was a cocky sort of guy. And I'm talking, this is like 25 years ago when I talked to these men. He was full of himself, he was a very opinionated character, had some interesting experiences in London during the Blitz and in traveling there for the Rad Lab. Had the makings of a little known story about a top secret invention that overcame the two biggest obstacles to D-Day that scarcely anyone has ever heard of. And I had a couple of men that were there doing it. Let me show you a slide. That is a resonant cavity magnetron. It was brought here by a technical mission sent from England in 1940 to show our top brass, military brass, our top scientists, what it could do. It now resides at the Canada Science and Technology Museum in Ottawa. This is unit number 12 of the very first 12 ever built in production. It was built in England. And it's a unit that was brought here, the very unit in 1940, that when showed to our scientists, just astonished them. Small thing, big enough to be held in the palm of a man's hand, small enough. And in my view, it is the single most influential new invention in the winning of the war that nobody has ever heard of. And I know that's a strong statement, but I will argue for it. Yes, the atomic bomb was certainly an earth-shaking invention, but it didn't win the war. When they dropped those two bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the war was already won. Those bombs ended it abruptly, and in so doing, saved thousands upon thousands of Allied lives from having to invade the Japanese mainland. There were other technical achievements, the breaking of Germany's Enigma code that allowed the Allies to read their dearest secrets. But that was not an invention. I consider that was a great mathematical achievement, but not an invention. So let me make my case. According to what most of us know from the history books, the Allied strategy for getting to D-Day was to strategically bomb Nazi Germany, destroy their war-making infrastructure, production plants, transportation, railroad switching yards, and energy sources like oil refineries. Then land troops and supplies on the Normandy coast, secure the beachhead, and fight their way on to Berlin and victory. But that overarching account told by historians really ignores the fact that without this new invention, the Allies would not have gotten to D-Day. Resonant cavity magnetron, this gadget, improved the performance of radar thousands-fold. All the developed nations had radar, but it was primitive. It was low frequency radio waves were used, and low frequency means large antennas, some are as big as the side of a barn, big power-hungry electronics equipment, certainly not suited, yes, for fixed installations for defense, but not for mobile offensive warfare. So let's look at January 1, 1944. After 4 years of bombing by the British and nearly 2 years of bombing by the US 8th Air Force from bases in Britain, Germany's war-making infrastructure was still operational, and her Air Force was still a potent threat. Yet the Allies were insisting on D-Day, staging D-Day that summer, but the preconditions had not yet been met. But just 6 months later, on June 6, 1944, the day the Allies put 150,000 men on the Normandy beaches, there was scarcely a German plane in the sky to oppose them. Of the relatively few German planes still airworthy, they had no spare parts to repair them. They had scarcely no fuel to run them, and scarcely any experienced pilots left to fly them. Those men had been shot down. So considering the earlier years of bombing by the RAF and the 8th Air Force and not getting the job done, how was it finally accomplished in just 6 months? Microwave radar, made possible by the Resonant Cavity Magnetron, was introduced into the bombing strategy in January 1944, 6 months to go. And it solved a huge obstacle to the bombing campaign, and why the prerequisites had not yet been achieved. Can anyone guess what that obstacle would be? It was the weather, the perpetually stormy, overcast, miserable European weather, especially during the winter months. Late spring, late fall, early spring. During those years of bombing, the previous years before January 1, 44, 70 to 80% of all bombing missions were scrubbed or recalled because of lack of visibility. Heavy bomber formations were able to complete their missions on average 7 days a month. Not enough. By late 1943, Air Force leaders knew that they had to do something different, or they'd be soon losing their aircraft to the Pacific Theater. So they took a big chance. They listened to the scientists, prayed that with a few radar-equipped bombers, a few of these sets installed in a few bombers to lead the formations, they could get up and complete missions nearly every day and finally achieve the prerequisites in time for D-Day. And this plan was fiercely resisted by many Air Force leaders and by certainly the veteran airmen in Europe. Let me show you a radar-equipped. I'm going to skip over this. It's a pretty technical. If anyone later would like me to talk about exactly how the magnetron worked, I can show you on this diagram. But let's move on. And I will do so later if somebody wants that. This is an image of a radar-equipped B-17 called a Pathfinder plane. If you notice that pod protruding from the belly of the aircraft, this plane is dropping the first bombs and marker and flares it will also drop for all the bombers in the wing behind him. He's in the lead. Starting early January, they led every mission. That pod you see contains the rotating radar antenna. There used to be, which they removed, there used to be a belly gunner's turret there that was removed, and they put in that radome containing the rotating antenna. This is a slide taken, this is a picture of the scope image, the radar scope image taken just before D-Day. Um, the plane is at the middle of the circles. It's called a PPI indicator, plan position indicator. And that white line you see here rotates and keeps refreshing that image as the plane moves. This is obvious. The plane is in over at this moment, the British Channel. I'm not sure whether it's heading away from or toward the shore, the Normandy shore, but you see Cherbourg in the west and Le Havre to the east. And that's what he had to. Now, these circles are range rings. And the operator can change the settings, but I'm going to guess there may be 5-mile range rings. This is 5, 10, 15 miles. As he approaches the shore, he can switch as he approaches his target. Let's say the target is near Cayenne, this little bright spot. He can switch range rings and go to and basically blow up the image. It comes and get more detail. Okay. What made radar, microwave radar, so superior? As we said, it allowed radar to be operated at much higher frequencies. That meant smaller antennas, smaller equipment that could be installed in planes, and the detection of much smaller objects. The higher the frequency, the shorter the wavelength, and you can detect more objects, like a submarine periscope sticking out of the vastness of the ocean, perhaps 30 miles away. The low-frequency radars of the time would be hard-pressed to even see a whole submarine sitting on the surface of the water at any useful distance. Before the cavity magnetron, the maximum power that anyone could transmit at these real high frequencies was only 20 watts. There was no transmitter tube that could do any better than that at these high frequencies. 20 watts of transmission power was not enough to be of use. It was okay for scientists to design circuits to handle these high frequencies, and which they did. And they were doing it, radar scientists all over the world, using this only gadget that was available, 20-watt gadget, because they knew they wanted to go to high frequencies. Well, the first time the resonant cavity magnetron was tested, this was a few months after Messrs. Randall and Boot invented it. They didn't even know if it was going to work. They tested on the bench a few months later. They transmitted 30,000 watts of power. Compare 20 watts to 30,000 watts in terms of a light bulb, 20-watt light bulb. That would be the same as the difference between that light and 3 carbon arc searchlights. There's no device, and only the Allies had this. The enemy was mystified by their losses. So the first obstacle actually were the U-boats. Britain is an island nation, requires open shipping lanes to survive. They were short of everything necessary for their survival. They were holding off the Nazi aggression for 2 years before the United States even entered the war. And many statesmen in the US and military leaders were convinced Britain would fall. Hitler's plan was to invade England in September of 1940. Karl Dönitz was commander of the U-boat fleet, and he boasted he could win the war with the U-boats alone. His goal was to sink 700,000 tons of shipping every month, more shipping than the Allies could replace, and Britain would fall. In the first 6 months of 1942 alone, U-boats sank 585 ships, over 3 million gross tons. That's an average of 2 ships every day. And at the time, there probably weren't more than 35 U-boats in combat at any one time. Dönitz wanted 100. And there were months when U-boats were sinking these huge tonnages in the shipping lanes without the loss of a single U-boat. That is a pretty efficient weapon. So how to locate and destroy them was the problem, and the radar scientists hastily designed and built what they called ASV radars, anti-surface vessel, microwave radars that could see a submarine conning tower in the water at 30 miles. No other radar in the world could even detect a single U-boat at that distance in the water. When submerged, however, the U-boats were powered by storage batteries. Storage batteries are what was used to propel them underwater and to run all the electrical systems in the U-boat. So they needed to surface every night under the cover of and the protection of darkness to recharge those batteries with their diesel engines. And that's when they were most vulnerable. Suddenly, at night, a U-boat would find itself bathed in light from above, and the bombs and the depth charges would fall. Dönitz couldn't figure it out, wondered if the Allies had some new kind of radar that he didn't know about. And he went to his scientists and consulted with them. And the German scientists told him, no, radar can't possibly do that. Microwave radar, location and destruction eventually pushed the U-boats from the shipping lanes, and Britain survived the U-boats and the Battle of the Atlantic. Admiral Dönitz, in his memoir after the war, referred to the scientists in England as the saviors of their country. Had the U-boats not been conquered by microwave radar, and had Britain fallen, from where would the Allies have launched any kind of a major, massive invasion? The rest of Europe was either Nazi-occupied or neutral. The second obstacle, of course, we've talked about, the weather. So let's go back to January 1, 1944. D-Day 6 months away. The requisites still not accomplished because of the weather. Yes, the 8th Air Force, these B-17s had this wonderful northern bomb sight, but if the bomb sight couldn't see through the overcast, I mean, these guys were flying at 20,000 feet, 30,000 feet. They couldn't bomb effectively without seeing the target. The Allies needed to get into the air nearly every day, bomb targets relentlessly, force the Luftwaffe, and this was a big part of the new strategy now, force the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, they'd been husbanding their aircraft into the air so they could have a chance at shooting them down. So at the beginning of January, the 8th Air Force totally revamped their bombing protocols. They put one of these radar planes in front of the formations. There were only 12 of them at the time on January 1. And the radar operator, by watching his scope, would direct the pilot to the target, and watching his scope and comparing the image, these smudges you see, to a map, he would find the target and drop the first bombs and marker flares. All the planes following would simply toggle their bombs to fall on his flares. Blind bombing. This next slide, here's a raid over Hamburg. Obviously totally overcast. Those black smudges you see bubbling through the overcast are burning all refineries. The plan was fraught with startup problems, equipment failures, unforeseen crew failures, trying to implement the new offensive weapon. In the early days, it was close to being shut down altogether. It was fiercely, as I said, resisted by veteran crews, squadron leaders, for a number of reasons. Some were legitimate, some were not. First, the radar bombing was not as accurate as visual bombing. But by getting into the air and completing so many more missions, they were definitely ahead of the game. Also, there was no prior combat bombing experience. There were no manuals to tell them what and how to do it. There wasn't being taught in the schools. The operators were learning by the seat of their pants, however. Slowly, the rest of the crew didn't know what they needed, didn't know what his problems were, but slowly the problems were being worked out. High-level meetings, and where am I? Gradually, especially some of the new navigators coming in, they grew to love this radar because it could give them accurate fixes on their way in and especially back from the target. These guys had to rely on dead reckoning without the radar. And anyone who's ever sailed on the open waters or flown a plane knows how dead reckoning errors can multiply as you go from waypoint to waypoint. So every so often, the radar guy could transmit a good fix for everybody in the formations. So just to answer the question, what did the cavity magnetron accomplish? Many things. Millions were manufactured for many other uses. One of the big uses was fire direction for the big guns on naval ships. It would lock on to a target and it would automatically aim, move the azimuth and altitude of the guns to intercept these targets, incoming targets. Anti-aircraft guns on shore to knock out incoming planes. There were millions manufactured. But to me, microwave radar was most influential in first winning battle of the Atlantic, the U-boat war, and then overcoming the foul, stormy European weather. Both critical impediments to D-Day. This is my last slide. That's a radar navigator he's holding a piece of flak pointing at the hole in the fuselage through which it burst, narrowly missing him. But hitting his radar equipment. He was on a bombing run at the time. Fortunately, somehow he completed the run and it was successful. And he came back. That's Uncle Stan. And that was the day that he was put up for his second Distinguished Flying Cross. His experience, and George Valley's experience, as well as other fascinating characters, add a human dimension to my book. I told you a bit about Valley. While Valley was striving away at the Rad Lab in Cambridge, Stan Fine was living a quiet life on a quiet Cambridge street. Cambridge, however, is what all these two men had in common. Stan was far removed from the high-powered technical achievements going on at MIT. He was a homeboy, an everyman, had probably never been more than 100 miles from Cambridge in his life. He had graduated high school with honors, and then, as expected of him, he went to work to help support the family. He was working toward a certificate in accounting, just as his elder brother had done 10 years earlier, my father. He was caught up in the peacetime draft at the age of 21 in 1941, before we were even at war. And a couple of years later, it was his destiny to cross paths with Valley in England. All these men, this small band of scientists and warriors, who they worked together to bring, for the first time, offensive radar to combat, had overcome first the apathy and the resistance of their own entrenched militaries before they could go on and overcome the enemy. If anyone is interested in reading the whole story, the book, Blind Bombing, it's available from Amazon, any of the popular online booksellers, or from your favorite bookshop. So I thank you very sincerely for listening, being here. I'll be happy to try to answer any questions you might have.
Wonderful. Thank you, Norman. That's a very interesting subject. And while we're waiting for some questions to come in, if you do have a question as you're watching, just put it into the chat feature and I'll pass it on to Norman for you. But while we're waiting, I was curious as you were talking. We, of course, are sending thousands of bombers over enemy territory. Many of them are shot down, and I know the Germans are, pouring over whatever remains of a downed plane for any technology. Did they ever find one of the this equipment and interpret what it was?
Yep. One of those first 12 that came with the MIT guys, those hand-built units that they brought, the first 12 hand-built, kind of shakily, they were, in fact, that's how they got the name Mickey. One of the majors saw one of those and said, my gosh, that's a real Mickey Mouse job. And that's how it got its name, Mickey. They had, but at any rate, to your question, yeah, one of those were lost, and eventually, and others were certainly lost. And at first, early on, the Allies did not want to use radar-equipped planes over Germany. They would use them over the like over France or Belgium or the occupied territories, but they didn't want to use them there either because they weren't as accurate as the precision, the Norden bomb sight. But yeah, one was found, and the reason why they didn't want them found was because this cavity magnetron was built was made out of a solid core of a brass cylinder in which holes were bored, as you saw briefly in one of those pictures. It was indestructible, and yeah, the Nazis found one, but by the time they looked at it and talked about it, and I don't even know when their own Air Force even heard about it, but it was just too late to do anything. It's sort of a funny story to tell about the resonant cavity magnet. A million of them were made by the Raytheon company, actually. And one of the top Raytheon engineers, Percy Spencer, was working on the bench with a magnetron that was running, and he noticed that the chocolate bar in his jacket pocket was melting. And he said, And that was the beginning. If you can remember that far back, Raytheon was the first company to come out with what they called the radar range. and it was the first microwave radar, microwave range, microwave oven. That's it. They later named a laboratory after Spencer, the Spencer Lab, and any other questions?
You mentioned that the Germans and I presume Japanese as well had not developed this technology. Were they even thinking in that direction at all?
Yes, certainly. I mean, every radar engineer that was seriously into radar in countries, any country, knew that they had to get to higher frequencies to reduce the size of the equipment, to make it and to provide more detail. But Randall and Boot came up with this gadget. In one afternoon, they got together and they chalked it on the chalkboard, and they excuse me, they expected it to work. Excuse me 1 second.
Go ahead.
And by gosh, it did. It sure did.
Very interesting. There were so many little things like that contributed to the Allied victory, and so few were really appreciated for what they added to the mix.
Right, but this really was a pretty little known story. I don't know how many people were even aware of it, but it was certainly made an important contribution.
Absolutely. Well, we've had no more questions submitted. We did have a couple of thank yous for a very informative program from some spectators, and we appreciate those comments as well. But let me thank you on behalf of the National D-Day Memorial for a great talk and really thought-provoking. And I know it's going to give me new appreciation the next time I read a book about the bombing campaign in Europe for what it was taking to make it a success. Again, thank you very much for joining us today. And you said earlier when we were chatting before the program, you had not visited the memorial, so let me invite you down.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. We'd love to show you around. And for all of our viewers, thank you for tuning in today, and look forward to our upcoming events and other virtual programs later this fall. So, thank you again.
To be here. My pleasure.
Wonderful. So, again, thank you all for joining us today.